We're going to go over 6.6 notes part 2 on kites. Now, there are basically three properties that deal with kites. One property is that it has two sets of consecutive congruent sides. So you have these two sides congruent, and then you have these two sides congruent. So, but those two sides, the pink and the blue, are not congruent to each other because you wouldn't have a kite, you would have a rhombus. And remember that kites are not parallelograms and kites are not trapezoids. Kites are kites. Okay, so the next property that we have is that the diagonals are perpendicular. So the diagonals always make a plus sign. And if you've looked at a kite, a real kite that you fly, um, it's usually attached by two poles that are perpendicular. The next property is that one pair of opposite angles are congruent. Now that pair have a specific location. They have to be, the angle has to be in the spot where two sides that are not congruent meet. So like right here, these two sides are not congruent and they're forming angle M. So the opposite angles M and P have to be congruent. M and P are congruent. R and N are never congruent because if you have M and P congruent and R and N congruent, then you're going to end up with a parallelogram, not a kite. So again, a kite is not a parallelogram, it's not a trapezoid, and for those reasons, you're not going to have the same properties. Okay? Let's move on to the questions. So you'll notice on the second page, there are a few examples for you to go over. I'm going to let you go over those on your own, and I'm going to take you to the examples on the next page. So let's start with number 1. So for number 1, we are looking for the measure of angle JRK. Now, if you look closely, you'll see that JRK is the angle made by the diagonals. And in a kite, the diagonals are perpendicular. So therefore, JRK has to be 90 degrees. For number 2, we have RJ equals 3. RK equals 10. And the question is find JK. So this is our X. Now, once again, the diagonals intersect at a 90-degree angle. And notice that we have a right triangle right here. All right, so you're going to have to do the Pythagorean theorem. X is the hypotenuse of this triangle. We know that because it's opposite the 90-degree angle. So 3 squared plus 10 squared equals x squared. All right, so I have 9 plus 100 equals x squared. So that means x squared is equal to 109, and therefore x is equal to the square root of 109. At this point, you can just figure out what it is in decimal form, and it's approximately 10.44. Okay, so here I am on number 3. If measure of angle GHJ is 90 and measure of GKJ is 110, so right here is 110. Now, before we move on, I want to stress that, again, this shape is not drawn to scale because the angle at K is clearly not 110 degrees if you're just looking at it. But we are just using a template of a kite diagram. So this is not drawn to scale. Okay, so keep that in mind as you do these. Okay, so given this information, we need to find measure of angle HGK, and HGK is over here, and this is the one that we're looking for. Now, remember that the opposite angles that are formed by the unequal sides are congruent. So I have 90 and I have 110. And then I have two angles that are congruent. I'm just going to call them both x. So we have x and then we have another x. And all of that has to add up to the sum of the angles in a quadrilateral, where the sum of the angles in a quadrilateral are 360 degrees. So lots of ways you can do this. You can set up an equation. I'm not going to bother. I'm just going to take 360 and I'm going to take away the sum of 90 and 110, which is 200. And that leaves me with 160. And that means the two angles, G and J, have to share 160. So I know I'm just going to divide 160 by 2. So that tells me that HGK is equal to 80 degrees, because 160 divided by 2 is 80 degrees. And if you add all of those angles together, 90 plus 110 plus 80 plus 80, you're going to get 360 degrees. For number 4, we have HJ equal to 7, and we need to find HG. Well, we know that these two sides in a kite are congruent, so HG is simply 7. That's it. For number 5, we have if HG equals 7 and GR equals 5, what's HR? Okay, so again, the diagonals are perpendicular. So I know that this is a right triangle, and that right here is a right angle. In this case, my hypotenuse is given, and it's 7. So to set up the Pythagorean theorem, I would write x squared plus 5 squared equals 7 squared, and then solve. X squared plus 25 equals 49. Subtract 25 from each side. X squared equals 24. And then x is equal to square root of 24. Now the radical 24 can be simplified into square root of 4 times square root of 6. And square root of 4 is 2. And then, so that's 2 square root of 6. That would be the simplified form. Or you can also get the decimal form of square root of 24. And that's roughly 4.9. So those are your two answers for number 5. Here I am on number 6. If measure of angle GHJ is 52 and measure of GKJ is 95. So once again, notice not drawn to scale. Find measure of angle HGK. HGK is over here. Remember, I'm going to call this X, and remember that this angle and the angle over here are congruent, so I'm just going to call that X. And all the angles have to add up to 360 degrees. This is similar to a question that we've already done. So we take 360 degrees, subtract 52 and 95. So subtract 52, subtract 95. I'll be right back with the answer. I got 213 degrees. And then the two angles at G and J have to share that. So 213 divided by 2 is equal to 106.5 degrees. I hope you guys are staying safe, and I hope all these videos are helping you out. Let me know if you need any help, and meet me at the Google Meets. Take care.